Of course, I've already mentioned one such sacred story that Jews grow up hearing and with which they struggle, the story of Exodus recalled in dramatized form on Passover. The central religious practice of Passover is a festive dinner known as a Seder that is held in the home and interspersed with prayer, discussion, and most crucial of all, the telling of the Exodus narrative. Significantly, surveys suggest that 80% of American Jews manage to attend a Seder each year, by far the most observed holiday. 80%. That is more Jews than believe in God or belong to a synagogue. That large percentage tells us that even Jews otherwise uninvolved in Jewish practice forge a connection with the Exodus narrative. Particularly important in my childhood memories are the Seders we attended at my grandmother's home in a formerly white and Jewish, but by the time I visited, virtually all African-American neighborhood in Brooklyn. During those visits, my grandmother would pull my sister and I close to her, and in her painful awareness of the ongoing virulence of American racism that still had its Jewish supporters, emphasized to us that she had wonderful neighbors, that they were good people, they were mensches, and that one should never judge people by the color of their skin. In those days, I took these little side lessons in anti-racism as entirely separate from the religious Jewish observance, the grand Seder meal that was the focal point of our visits. Over time, however, I have realized the two are interrelated. My grandmother's concern that we not internalize racial stereotypes about her black neighbors was in part the efflux of the way she herself had internalized the Exodus narrative. Of course, when you look at me now, you do not see someone who is the descendant of slaves. You see a white guy. And however much my internal consciousness of identity might differ from non-Jewish whites, you would be correct to judge that nearly all, if not all, the privileges of whiteness that race theorists identify have been mine. The appearance that my whiteness has always been obvious, however, is deceiving. For example, when more than 1.5 million Eastern European Jews, mostly very poor, came to the US in the late 19th century as they fled persecution and economic hardship, it was still not clear that they would be regarded as white. Ultimately, rather than being viewed as a separate race, as Jews were in Europe, Jews in America have been given the advantage of being considered part of the dominant class. And this fact, combined with much hard work, has allowed Jewish communities to thrive. The story of Jewish immigration to America has thus become told as a simple success story, a triumph of American pluralism. As more recent scholarship, such as the work of historian Eric Goldstein, has shown, however, Jews paid a price for the upward mobility that their designation as white afforded them. Since becoming white meant living in better neighborhoods, educational advancement, and more, immigrant Jews were naturally keen to win these advantages for their children, but the emotions were often mixed. In many immigrant Jewish hearts, the memory of very real persecution in their former host countries, combined with the more abstract religious teachings about their mythic origins as slaves in Egypt, made their identification as simply white an uncomfortable fit with deeply held values. Still today, it feels odd to many Jews to tick the white Caucasian box on demographic surveys. Jews were more or less free from persecution in America, but only at the price of giving up both ritual and ethical practices that made Jews a distinct community in the first place. My grandmother did not, as far as I remember, ever offer one of her anti-racist lessons as justified by Judaism. Similarly, while Jews did disproportionately support the African-American civil rights movement led by blacks in the 1950s and 60s, the Jews who did this were almost always secular Jews who did not necessarily consciously connect their commitment to civil rights and their Jewish roots. Despite that conscious self-image as ordinary white liberals, though, it is hard to imagine that without the Jewish experience of oppression and the shaping of that experience through the Exodus narrative, Jews would have differed from other white-passing Americans in their response to the civil rights movement. If we imagine, as I suggested, that religion is in part about living a narrative, then we can perhaps see how the words my grandmother presented as having little to do with religion were arguably the most religious lessons she taught. Quite apart from the Seder, but in no less a Jewish lesson, my grandmother expressed to me the sentiment that the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel would later express this way. Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking. Of course, many American Jews, unlike Heschel, went along to get along and were full participants in the racism that continues to assert itself in the US. But what requires explanation is why Jews were more likely to resist American racism than other white communities with similar immigrant patterns. Like other religious minorities, Jews have responded to the paradox of American tolerance and intolerance in diverse ways. But all American Jews have had to respond to a tension between their religious identity as the descendants of slaves in Egypt and the ambivalent way in which America, unique among all Western nations, classified Jews as part of the majority. Attending to this tension not only teaches us something about Judaism, but something about America. The tolerance towards Jews that is one of the most impressive features of American democracy cannot, unfortunately, be viewed as an indication of the demise of prejudice and the creation of a so-called post-racial America. American Jews did not win the unique freedom from persecution that they have experienced in America only by being accepted by Jews, as Jews, but rather because they came to be viewed by white elites as more like them than not. In the end, the point of these reflections can be summarized as follows. First, the American Jewish experience is a complex story of both triumph and trial. American Jews have done well, but at a price to the very values that had made Judaism Jewish. Some contemporary Jews reasonably fear that Jews may be so assimilated in America that Judaism will cease to survive. Second, attention to the American Jewish experience exposes the complex intertwinement of race and religion in the United States. The religious tolerance for Jews that is something Americans can rightly be proud of belies the ongoing reality of racial thinking that continues to make the Promised Land a promissory note. The drama of Exodus, the movement from slavery to freedom, has not yet been completed. Thank you.